When Evelyn Hartwell hired a black craftsman to fix her marble countertops, she had no idea that watching his hands work the stone would awaken desires she'd spent 42 years learning to suppress her, that the heat building between them would prove far more dangerous than any scandal her corporate world could imagine. The morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows turned her Carrara marble kitchen into a cathedral of privilege, all gleaming surfaces and imported Italian stone that cost more than most people's cars. Evelyn stood barefoot on heated floors, her silk robe barely tied as she watched Marcus Thompson's powerful hands move across the damaged countertop with reverent precision. His dark skin a stark contrast against the pale marble that had defined her carefully curated world. The previous installer didn't understand the stone's natural stress points, Marcus said, his deep voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd mastered his craft through years of dedication rather than expensive degrees. His fingers traced hairline cracks with the same delicacy a surgeon might use on exposed nerves. And Evelyn found herself hypnotized by the gentle strength in those movements. She reached for her coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly, motion causing her robe to shift and reveal the smooth curve of her thigh. Marcus's eyes flickered upward for just a moment, long enough for heat to spark between them like static electricity before he returned his attention to the stone with deliberate professionalism that somehow felt more intimate than a lingering stare. "How long will the repair take?" Evelyn asked, her voice carrying the breathless quality of someone fighting an attraction that violated every unspoken rule of her social sphere. The morning news played softly from hidden speakers, reporting stock prices and political scandals that suddenly felt irrelevant compared to the way Marcus's shoulders moved beneath his work shirt. "Depends on how deep the damage goes," he replied, his hands never pausing in their exploration of the marble's wounded surface. "Sometimes what looks like surface damage runs all the way through the core. You have to be willing to go deeper than you planned to find the real problem." The words hung between them like a challenge wrapped in professional courtesy, while Evelyn's pulse quickened with the recognition that they weren't just talking about stone anymore. She watched his fingers work the marble with increasing fascination, imagining those same hands mapping the contours of her body with equal skill and patience, discovering places that had been neglected far longer than any damaged countertop. When Marcus looked up and caught her staring, his dark eyes held a knowledge that made her silk robe feel transparent against skin that suddenly burned with needs she'd forgotten she possessed. The 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower felt like a fortress of glass and steel, where Evelyn had built her reputation one calculated decision at a time. But this morning the pristine boardroom couldn't contain the chaos Marcus Thompson had unleashed in her carefully ordered mind. She sat at the head of the polished conference table, platinum hair pulled into the severe chignon that had become her signature, while her assistant Sarah shuffled through quarterly reports that suddenly seemed as irrelevant as last season's. "Fashion. The Henderson Group wants to move forward with the campaign," Sarah said, her efficient voice cutting through the morning haze that had nothing to do with the Seattle fog pressing against floor-to-ceiling windows. "They're requesting a presentation for next week." Evelyn nodded with automatic precision, her manicured fingers tracing the edge of her tablet while her mind replayed the way Marcus's hands had moved across damaged marble with reverent skill. The contrast between his calloused palms and the smooth stone had created images that made her shift uncomfortably in her ergonomic chair, crossing her legs beneath the mahogany table to ease an ache that had nothing to do with poor posture. "Mrs. Hartwell." Sarah's concerned voice penetrated the haze. "Should I schedule the Henderson meeting for Thursday morning?" "Yes, of course," Evelyn managed, then cleared her throat with the authority that had carried her through hostile takeovers and boardroom battles. "Sarah, could you give me a moment? I need to make a personal call about the kitchen renovation." When her assistant disappeared with characteristic efficiency, Evelyn found Marcus's business card with hands that trembled slightly. The simple, black lettering reading Thompson's Stonework, master craftsman, feeling like contraband in her executive sanctuary. She dialed with deliberate precision, each number a step further from the professional boundaries that had defined her existence for 2 decades. Thompson's Stonework. His voice rumbled through her phone's speaker, and Evelyn felt heat pool low in her belly like aged whiskey, burning pleasant trails toward dangerous territory. "Marcus, it's Evelyn Hartwell," she said, proud that her voice carried no trace of the desire coursing through her bloodstream. "I've been thinking about the repair. Timeline you mentioned, the marble work?" His tone remained professionally distant, but she caught something underneath a warmth that made her pulse quicken against her throat. "I could probably extend the project if you're interested in upgrading other surfaces." Her free hand moved unconsciously to her collarbone as he described the intricate process of matching stone grain patterns, his deep voice painting images of patient hands working resistant material into submission. When he mentioned the importance of applying steady pressure to achieve proper results, Evelyn's fingers found the pulse point at her throat, imagining those same hands applying their skilled attention to her neglected body. "How soon could you start the additional work?" she asked, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the hunger she could no longer deny. The June heat had turned Evelyn's kitchen into a furnace, despite the central air conditioning that usually kept her marble sanctuary at perfect temperature. And Marcus had stripped his work shirt with the unselfconscious efficiency of a man focused entirely on his craft. Sweat glistened across shoulders that spoke of years spent coaxing beauty from unforgiving stone, his dark skin creating stark contrast against the pale Carrara marble that had never looked more expensive or more cold. "The veining here tells a story," Marcus said, his voice carrying the reverent tone of someone who understood that marble was geology made art. His hands moved across the repaired surface with intimate knowledge, fingers tracing patterns that had formed over millennia beneath Mediterranean pressure. Each line represents thousands of years of transformation. Evelyn found herself drawn closer, despite every instinct screaming that proximity to this man threatened everything she'd built. The scent of honest labor and expensive cologne created an intoxicating combination that made her silk blouse cling uncomfortably to skin that felt electrified by his presence. "Show me," she whispered, the words escaping before her executive training could stop them. Marcus's eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then he positioned himself behind her, his chest radiating heat against her back, as his hands covered hers, guiding her palms across the marble's smooth surface. The stone felt impossibly cool beneath their joined touch while fire built between them, his arousal pressing unmistakably against the small of her back through fabric that suddenly felt gossamer thin. "Feel how the grain flows," he murmured against her ear, his thumb tracing lazy circles on her wrist while her pulse hammered beneath his touch. "The stone remembers every pressure, every moment that shaped it into something beautiful." Evelyn's head fell back against his shoulder as his words painted images of transformation through pressure, of beauty emerging from forces that should have destroyed rather than created. When his free hand settled on her hip with possessive certainty, she felt herself melting like expensive chocolate left too long in summer heat. The doorbell's sharp intrusion shattered the moment like crystal hitting marble. Both of them jumping apart with guilty efficiency as Mrs. Chen's voice called through the front door about a package delivery. Marcus reached for his discarded shirt with hands that shook slightly while Evelyn smoothed her hair with trembling fingers, both acutely aware that they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I should get that," Evelyn managed, her voice carrying the breathless quality of someone who'd just discovered that professional boundaries were far more fragile than imported stone. But as she walked toward the door, She could feel Marcus's eyes tracking her movement with the same reverent attention he'd shown the marble. And she knew that whatever Mrs. Chen wanted couldn't possibly be as dangerous as the hunger. Building in her kitchen, the wine cellar beneath. Evelyn's house felt like a cathedral dedicated to excess. Temperature-controlled darkness housing bottles that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. But tonight, the expensive Bordeaux tasted like liquid courage as she watched. Marcus examined her collection with the same reverent attention he'd shown her damaged marble. His work shirt was buttoned again, a barrier between them that felt both necessary and unbearable after the afternoon's electric encounter. Chateau Margaux, 1982, Marcus said, his calloused fingers tracing the dusty label with surprising gentleness. My father would have called this liquid poetry. He taught me that craftsmanship doesn't recognize price tags, only dedication to excellence. Evelyn's breath caught at the unexpected sophistication in his observation, her assumptions about class and education crumbling like poorly mixed mortar. She poured 2 glasses of wine that probably cost more than his weekly earnings. The irony, not lost on either of them, as expensive crystal met honest hands. Your father was a craftsman too? She asked, settling onto the leather bench that ran along one wall, hyper-aware that the intimate space made every gesture feel loaded with possibility. Stone carver in Ghana before he came here, Marcus replied, accepting the wine with a dignity that made her corporate training feel like cheap theater. He said Americans think expensive means quality. But real value comes from understanding your materials, knowing when to be gentle and when to apply pressure. The way he said pressure made heat pool in her belly, his dark eyes holding hers as she brought the wine to her lips. The vintage's complexity exploded across her tongue, while Marcus watched her mouth with predatory focus. And Evelyn found herself tracing the crystal rim with deliberate slowness, her tongue darting out to catch a stray drop of wine that felt like sinful luxury against her lower lip. Are you applying pressure or being gentle with my marble? She asked, her voice carrying implications that had nothing to do with stonework. The wine was making her bold, stripping away executive polish to reveal a woman who'd forgotten what it felt like to be desired rather than merely respected. Marcus set down his glass with deliberate precision, his movements slow and controlled, like a predator deciding whether to pounce or retreat. Depends on what the stone needs, he said quietly, his voice rough with restraint that was clearly costing him. Some materials require patience. Others respond better too. Decisive action, the words hung between them like a promise wrapped in professional metaphor. All expensive wine turned the air thick with possibility and the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. When Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes dark with hunger that matched her own, Evelyn realized that the most expensive thing in her cellar wasn't the vintage they were drinking, it was the price she'd pay for whatever happened next. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke as they returned to the kitchen. Rain lashing against floor-to-ceiling windows, while lightning illuminated the marble island where Marcus's craftsmanship gleamed like an altar to forbidden desire. The wine had stripped away Evelyn's carefully maintained boundaries, leaving her raw and honest in ways that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "We shouldn't," she whispered, even as she moved closer to where Marcus stood beside his restored stonework, stark eyes holding promises that made her pulse hammer against her throat. "No," he agreed, his voice rough with want as his hands found her waist. "We absolutely shouldn't." But when thunder crashed overhead, drowning out rational thought, Marcus lifted her onto the cool marble with reverent strength, positioning her exactly where his hands had worked stone into submission. The contrast between heated skin and cold marble made Evelyn gasp, her silk dress riding up her thighs as she wrapped her legs around him, pulling him into the space between propriety and primal need. "This is my work," Marcus murmured against her throat, his mouth finding the pulse point that betrayed every rational thought she'd ever entertained. And now, you're part of it. His hands explored beneath silk with the same patient skill he'd shown the marble, mapping territory that had been neglected far too long while. Evelyn arched against stone that felt like ice against skin that burned. With awakening, when his thumb found sensitive places that made her cry out, thunder masked the sound of her surrender. Nature providing cover for the most natural thing in the world. "Marcus," she breathed, his name becoming prayer and profanity, as skilled fingers brought her to the edge of reason. The marble beneath her absorbed her heat while he worshipped her body with reverent attention, each touch claiming her as thoroughly as he'd claimed the stone. When release finally shattered through her like lightning finding ground, Evelyn understood that they'd crossed more than physical boundaries. They'd marked each other with possession that went deeper than skin, claiming territory in the most primal way possible. As Marcus held her against his chest, both breathing hard while rain continued its assault on expensive windows, she realized the storm outside was nothing compared to what they'd unleashed between them. "What happens now?" she whispered against his shoulder, tasting salt and certainty on skin that felt like home. Marcus's hands tightened possessively on her waist as another flash of lightning illuminated their reflection in the dark windows to people who'd just discovered that some hungers were worth any consequence. "Now we deal with what we've started," he said quietly, his voice carrying promises that felt both threatening and absolutely necessary. Morning light streamed through Evelyn's bedroom windows like judgment rendered in gold, illuminating silk sheets that still carried the scent of transgression and expensive wine, while her body ached with the pleasant soreness of a woman who'd finally remembered what desire felt like. She moved carefully as she dressed for her lunch with Victoria, hyper-aware of how Marcus's hands had mapped every sensitive place, claiming territory that no amount of expensive perfume could erase from memory. The marble counter greeted her like a co-conspirator as she reached for coffee, its cool surface beneath her palms, triggering vivid flashbacks of strong hands, lifting her onto stone that had absorbed her heat and witnessed her complete surrender. Her face flushed with renewed desire despite the guilt clawing at her throat, her body betraying every rational thought about appropriate behavior for women of her social standing. Marcus appeared in the kitchen, a doorway like morning temptation, his work clothes rumpled and his dark eyes holding knowledge that made her pulse quicken against her professional blouse. "About last night," he began, his voice carrying the rough honesty that had first drawn her into dangerous territory. "We can't," Evelyn interrupted, her executive training reasserting itself even as her body leaned toward him like metal-finding magnet. "I have obligations, expectations, people who depend on my reputation remaining intact." The pain that flickered across Marcus's features made her chest tighten with regret. But before either could say more, her phone buzzed with Victoria's text, confirming their lunch reservation at the club where appearances mattered more than truth. Meridian Country Club felt like a museum dedicated to old money and older prejudices. All crystal chandeliers and whispered conversations were Evelyn's. Sister Victoria held court among women who'd never questioned their privileged position in Seattle's social hierarchy. Victoria's blonde perfection and inherited pearls created a stark contrast to the working-class authenticity that had awakened Evelyn's dormant desires. "You look different," Victoria observed, with the sharp eyes of someone trained to detect social weakness. "Flushed. Like you've been getting more exercise than your usual Pilates routine." Evelyn's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she fought to maintain composure. "The renovation has been stressful. Contractors tracking dust through the house, disrupting my normal routine." Speaking of contractors, Victoria continued with calculated precision. "Margaret Hendricks mentioned seeing quite an attractive black man leaving your house rather late last evening. She was concerned about security in the neighborhood." The coded language hit Evelyn like ice water. making her realize that her family's racism ran deeper than casual prejudice. It was institutional, systemic, designed to keep people like Marcus in their designated places while women like her remain safely contained within acceptable boundaries. "My contractor is extremely professional," Evelyn said carefully, her voice carrying defiance that surprised them both. Victoria's smile sharpened. "Like expensive steel." "I certainly hope so, darling. Would be such a shame if poor judgment affected your standing at the firm." The Meridian Country Club's annual charity luncheon felt like a battlefield disguised as philanthropy. All starched linens and forced smiles where Seattle's elite gathered to write tax-deductible checks while dissecting each other's reputations. With surgical precision, Evelyn sat at table 12, feeling like an imposter in her own social circle, hyper-aware that every glance carried judgment and every whispered conversation might contain fragments of speculation about her increasingly obvious moral decline. "The Children's Hospital renovation is proceeding beautifully," chirped Margaret Hendricks, her diamond tennis bracelet catching light as she gestured toward the silent auction displays. "Though I must say, finding reliable contractors has become such a challenge. One simply can't be too careful about who one allows into intimate spaces." The emphasis on intimate spaces hit Evelyn like a calculated slap, making her wineglass tremble against manicured fingernails that suddenly felt like weapons she'd forgotten how to wield. Around the table, other women nodded with the satisfied authority of those who'd never questioned their right to judge others, while remaining safely insulated from genuine consequence. "Security is paramount," agreed Caroline Whitmore, her voice carrying the particular venom reserved for discussing threats to established order, especially for single women in positions of vulnerability. "The help can be so presumptuous when proper boundaries aren't maintained." Evelyn felt blood drain from her face as she realized the conversation wasn't about general contractor concerns. It was a coordinated attack designed to flush out her secrets while maintaining plausible deniability. These women had built careers from social warfare conducted through charity events and garden parties, their weapons honed by generations of practice in destroying reputations while maintaining perfect manicures. "I heard the most disturbing story about a woman in Bellevue," Margaret continued with theatrical concern. "Apparently, she became involved with her renovation crew. Can you imagine? The scandal nearly destroyed her family's standing at the yacht club." The silence that followed felt loaded with accusation, while Evelyn fought to maintain composure that cracked like expensive china under pressure. When she excused herself to the powder room, she caught fragments of whispered conversation that confirmed her worst fears. Double quotes, ... "Definitely something inappropriate happening. ... That black contractor leaving so late. ... Always thought she was too independent for her own good." Standing in the marble-appointed bathroom that reminded her painfully of Marcus's skilled hands working stone into submission, Evelyn realized her carefully constructed world was collapsing one whispered rumor at a time. The same women who'd celebrated her divorce as liberation now viewed her freedom as dangerous precedent, her choices threatening their carefully maintained illusions about appropriate behavior for women of their class. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus asking about dinner, and Evelyn understood she was approaching a point where choosing him would mean losing everything else. Losing him would mean losing herself. Marcus's workshop occupied a converted warehouse in Georgetown, where gentrification hadn't yet polished away the neighborhood's working-class authenticity. And Evelyn felt like an exotic bird in her designer heels as she navigated cracked sidewalks toward a world that existed entirely outside her privileged experience. The building's industrial honesty made her realize how insulated she'd become, how her marble kitchen represented just one small corner of a much larger universe. "You came," Marcus said, opening the heavy door with surprise that made her chest tighten with recognition of how easily she could have chosen safety over curiosity. His brother Jerome looked up from where he was teaching a young girl to sandwood, both sharing the same strong features that spoke of inherited dignity rather than acquired polish. "This is Zoe," Marcus said proudly, his hand resting on the child's shoulder with protective gentleness. "My daughter. She's visiting this weekend." The word daughter hit Evelyn like revelation, making her realize how little she actually knew about the man whose hands had claimed her so thoroughly. Her assumptions about his life crumbled as she watched him interact with the 8-year-old who clearly adored her father. Their easy affection creating intimacy that had nothing to do with sexual desire and everything to do with authentic connection. "These are beautiful," Evelyn breathed, discovering marble sculptures that transformed cold stone into flowing representations of human emotion. Marcus's artistic vision revealed itself in pieces that spoke of struggle and triumph, of hands that understood both destruction and creation with equal skill. "My real work," Marcus said quietly, leading her toward the private studio where his most personal creations waited like confessions carved in stone. The raw masculinity of his artistic passion overwhelmed her. This wasn't just craftsmanship, but pure creative fire that transformed ordinary material into extraordinary beauty. When he pulled her against the workbench where chisels and hammers created tools of transformation, Evelyn surrendered to hunger that felt different, now deeper, more complex than simple physical desire. Their coupling was urgent and desperate, surrounded by his artistic legacy, while sawdust and marble dust created clouds that settled on heated skin like benediction. "Is this just rebellion for you?" Marcus whispered against her throat afterward, his voice carrying vulnerability that made her realize how easily she could wound him. Rich white woman slumming with the help. The accusation cut deeper than any country club whisper because it came from someone whose opinion had started to matter more than social approval. As they separated, both breathing hard while his sculptures bore witness to their passion, Evelyn understood that wanting Marcus meant confronting not just external prejudice, but her own unconscious assumptions about class, race, and what qualified as worthy love. "No," she said fiercely, her voice carrying conviction that surprised them both. "This is me finally finding something real." The executive conference room felt like a tribunal when Robert Thorne summoned Evelyn at 8:30 Monday morning, his silver hair and conservative suit radiating the kind of authority that had built Meridian Holdings into Seattle's most exclusive consulting firm. His laptop sat open on the mahogany table like evidence waiting to convict, while morning light through floor-to-ceiling windows turned the glass towers below into witnesses to her professional execution. "Evelyn, please sit," Robert said with the careful neutrality of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "We need to discuss some concerning security footage from Friday evening." Her blood turned to ice as she realized what he'd discovered, her mind flashing to the moment when longing had overwhelmed professionalism. When Marcus had arrived at her office with dinner and she'd forgotten everything except the hunger that had been building for weeks. The mahogany desk where she'd conducted million-dollar negotiations had become an altar to desire that security cameras had faithfully recorded. "I don't think I need to explain how this affects your position here," Robert continued, turning the laptop toward her with the efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering consequences. The grainy footage showed her legs wrapped around Marcus on her executive desk, their passionate embrace captured in black and white that made their transgression look both clinical and damning. "Robert, I can explain," she began, her voice cracking under the weight of professional suicide unfolding in real time. "Can you explain how sleeping with contractors aligns with our firm's values?" His question carried the particular coldness reserved for employees who'd violated trust so completely that redemption became impossible. "Can you explain how this reflects on our reputation with conservative clients who value traditional leadership?" The Coded language hit her like familiar poison, the same institutional racism and classism that her country club friends wielded like weapons, now deployed by the man who controlled her career. Outside, Marcus waited in his truck with the patient dignity of someone who'd probably expected this moment since their first kiss. "I'm suspending you pending a full review," Robert announced with finality that felt like doors slamming shut on everything she'd worked to build. "Your clients will be reassigned immediately. Security will escort you out within the hour." Walking toward the elevator with a cardboard box containing 20 years of professional achievements, Evelyn felt the weight of choice crystallizing around her like expensive crystal under pressure. Through tinted glass, she could see Marcus's truck idling at the curb. And she realized that losing everything she'd thought mattered might be the price of finding something that actually did. The elevator doors closed like a coffin. But for the first time in decades, Evelyn felt the terrifying freedom that came from having nothing left to lose except the chance at authentic love. Evelyn's house felt like a mausoleum dedicated to abandoned ambitions. All marble surfaces and designer furniture that suddenly seemed as cold and lifeless as the career she'd just watched evaporate in a conference room 42 floors above the city. The silence pressed against her like judgment rendered in expensive acoustics. While she sat on the sofa where she'd once planned hostile takeovers, now planning nothing more complex than how to survive professional exile, Victoria's arrival felt inevitable as winter, her sister sweeping through the front door with the righteous fury of someone whose warnings had been vindicated by spectacular failure. Behind her came the weight of family disappointment that had been building since childhood, crystallizing now into consequences that would reshape Evelyn's entire existence. "Mother wants to speak with you," Victoria announced, setting her phone on the coffee table like evidence in a trial where guilt had already been established. "She's flying back from Charleston specifically to deal with this embarrassment." Their mother's voice crackled through the speaker with the particular authority of someone accustomed to controlling family narratives through financial leverage. "Evelyn, darling, I've spoken with Robert Thorne. This situation can still be contained. If you show appropriate remorse and distance yourself from inappropriate influences." The coded language felt familiar as expensive perfume. But now it carried threats that made Evelyn's chest tighten with recognition of how completely her family viewed Marcus as contamination rather than connection. Their racism ran deeper than social prejudice, it was existential, treating her love as evidence of mental breakdown rather than authentic choice. "If you continue this destructive path," Eleanor continued with surgical precision, "I'll have no choice but to reassess your inheritance and your position in this family. Some choices have consequences that extend beyond individual selfishness." The ultimatum hung in the air like expensive crystal waiting to shatter, while Victoria watched with the satisfaction of someone whose conventional choices had just been validated by others' spectacular failures. When the call ended, Evelyn felt the weight of complete isolation settling around her like expensive silk that had become a shroud. Alone in her bedroom afterward, she found herself touching the places where Marcus's hands had claimed her, remembering the reverent way he'd worshipped her body with skills that transcended class and prejudice. The defiance that built in her chest felt like fire consuming everything she'd been taught to value, burning away obligations that had never brought her genuine happiness. Her reflection in the bedroom mirror showed a woman who looked older, but somehow more alive, stripped of illusions about family loyalty and social acceptance. When her phone buzzed with Marcus's text asking if she was okay, Evelyn realized she'd reached the point where choosing love meant choosing herself, and that some prices were worth paying for the chance at authentic connection. The question was whether courage felt more like falling or flying when everything safe had been stripped away. The thunderstorm that had been threatening all evening finally broke, as Evelyn drove through Georgetown's rain-slick streets toward Marcus's workshop. Her designer clothes soaked through and her carefully maintained composure shattered like expensive crystal under pressure. She'd lost everything: career, family, social standing, but sitting in her car outside the converted warehouse. She realized she'd also lost the weight of expectations that had crushed her authentic self for 42 years. Marcus opened the workshop door before she could knock, his dark eyes taking in her rain-soaked appearance with concern that transformed into something primal when he saw the fierce determination in her face. Without words, he pulled her against his chest with desperate hunger, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted like freedom and defiance, like choosing courage over comfort in the most fundamental way possible. "I lost everything, Evelyn," whispered against his lips, her voice carrying triumph rather than defeat. "My job, my family, my inheritance. And I don't care, because none of it was real without you." Thunder crashed overhead as Marcus lifted her onto the workbench where his tools lay scattered like instruments of transformation, his hands claiming her with the same reverent skill he brought to stone, but with urgency that spoke of hunger too long denied. When she wrapped her legs around him, pulling him deeper into heat that felt like coming home, Evelyn discovered that surrender could feel like victory when chosen freely. "Show me," she demanded, her voice raw with need as she guided his hands, two places that belonged to him now, completely and without reservation. "Show me what it means to be chosen." Their lovemaking was fierce and primal, marking each other with possession that transcended social boundaries and family expectations. When Evelyn rode him with abandonment that would have horrified her former self, she felt every constraint fall away like expensive clothing that had never fit properly, leaving her naked and honest in ways that went deeper than physical intimacy. The workshop became cathedral and confessional as they celebrated courage with bodies that understood truth better than minds trained in deception. Multiple waves of pleasure crashed through her like thunder finding ground, each climax a declaration of independence from everything she'd been taught to value over authentic connection. "I choose you," Evelyn gasped against his shoulder as their breathing slowly returned to normal, her words carrying the weight of transformation complete. "Not because you're forbidden or dangerous, but because you're real. Because what we have is real." Marcus's hands tightened possessively on her waist as rain continued its assault on warehouse windows, both understanding that they'd just crossed from desire into something permanent, something worth whatever storms lay ahead. The East Side Gallery buzzed with opening night energy as Marcus's marble sculptures commanded attention from collectors who understood that authentic artistry transcended social categories. And Evelyn stood beside him wearing confidence that had been earned rather than inherited, her simple black dress a far cry from the designer armor she'd once hidden behind. The diverse crowds celebrating his work felt like the world she'd never known. She wanted donest, complicated, real in ways her country club existence had never been. "Dad's famous now," Zoe whispered conspiratorially, her 8-year-old excitement infectious as she pointed toward the sculpture that had already sold to a tech entrepreneur who appreciated beauty over pedigree. The child had accepted Evelyn with the uncomplicated affection of someone who judged people by their kindness rather than their bank accounts. Victoria appeared near the wine station with her husband, their presence unexpected but welcome in the way that genuine reconciliation always surprised. "The pieces are extraordinary," Victoria admitted quietly, her earlier prejudices worn away by time and the undeniable evidence of Marcus's talent. "I may have been hasty in my initial assessment." The admission felt like forgiveness wrapped in careful diplomacy, family bonds slowly healing around the reality that Evelyn's choices had led to authentic happiness rather than social destruction. Not everyone had come around their mother, remained stubbornly absent, but the people who mattered most had learned to see past surface differences to the connection underneath. She's proud, but won't admit it, Victoria continued, following Evelyn's gaze toward the entrance where Eleanor would never appear. Change takes time, especially for someone who built her identity around never being wrong about people. Marcus's hand found Evelyn's with automatic intimacy as they moved through the gallery. Both comfortable with the way other couples looked at them, some with curiosity, others with approval, most with the acceptance that came from witnessing genuine partnership. When they paused before his latest creation, a marble sculpture of intertwined lovers that captured the moment passion transformed into permanent connection, Evelyn felt heat build between them despite the public setting. "This one's not for sale," Marcus murmured against her ear, his thumb tracing circles on her wrist that made her pulse quicken with familiar hunger. The sculpture showed bodies claiming each other with reverent desperation, and Evelyn recognized their own story carved in stone that would last centuries. "Good," she whispered back, her voice carrying promises about their evening plans. "Some things are too precious to share." As the gallery celebration continued around them, Evelyn understood that building a life together meant creating something beautiful from the raw materials of courage and choice, sculpting happiness from the willingness to choose love over everything else that seemed easier but felt hollow. Their hands intertwined like the marble lovers, both knowing that some foundations were strong enough to support whatever came next.